Close your eyes. It's after images.
You're listening to After Images, a podcast for cinephiles that takes a deep dive into moving images. Each episode features a special guest who is invited to explore a film of their choice. After Images is hosted by film writers Frank Bouleg and Marisa C. Hayes. Our 40th episode takes us to the American Southwest for a discussion with author Anne Hillerman about the thriller television series Dark Winds. The television series is based on the Leaphorn and Chee novels, originally written by Tony Hillerman and today continued by his daughter Anne. The television adaptation is produced by George R.R. Martin and Robert Redford. It premiered in 2022, and its fourth season is mere days away. Set in the 1970s, it follows three Navajo tribal police officers, Joe Leaphorn, Bernadette Manuelito, and Jim Chee, as they investigate various cases alone or with the help, and sometimes hindrances, of the FBI. Beautifully written and set in the magnificent scenery of the Four Corners area of the American Southwest, the series gives us the opportunity to learn more about the Navajo Nation, Diné mythology, culture, and language.
After a successful career as a reporter and editor, Anne Hillerman began a new career as a mystery writer following the death of her father, Tony Hillerman. In addition to writing 11 novels in the Joe Leaphorn, Jim Chee, Bernadette Manuelito series, Anne is an executive producer of the award-winning television series Dark Winds and the trustee of the Tony Hillerman Literary Estate. Welcome, Anne Hillerman. We are so delighted to have you today with us on After Images podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to have a chance to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. And we're delighted to speak with you today about your books, your father's books, and the transition that they've made today to an award-winning series that people just love and will be returning to the small screen soon, and that is Dark Winds, of course. And I thought to kick off, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this transition from the page to the screen. How did that come about?
Well, I would be glad to talk about that. It's sort of a long story because it began many years ago when my dad's writing career, oh, you could say it was sort of at its peak. He'd had several books that had been New York Times bestsellers, and his writing came to the attention of Robert Redford. And so Robert Redford called my father and he said, I would love to talk to you about doing something with your stories to make a television series or movies. And my dad said, oh, sure, that would be great. And then Redford said, well, what about on a Tuesday night? And he gave Dad the date. And Dad said, oh, sorry, I can't talk on Tuesday nights. And Redford said, oh, well, why not? And Dad said, well, that's my poker night. And I can't say no to my long-term poker game. And so then he went to talk to his poker guys, and he said, oh, guess what? Redford called me and he wanted to talk to me tonight, but I said, oh, I couldn't do it because I had to play poker with you guys. And I thought it was so interesting. The older men in the poker group said, oh, of course not. You had to play poker with us. And the younger men, and it was only men in this group, the younger men said, what? You said no to Robert Redford and you're here playing poker with us. And anyway, they rescheduled, Dad and Robert Redford rescheduled, and eventually Dad did a contract with Robert Redford. And that contract resulted in 3 of his books being made into a television series that broadcasting was doing. done Masterpiece Theater, but at that point it was, I think, mostly British novels. And they wanted to do American Masterpiece Theater, and they thought it would be great to start with my dad's stories. So that was what Robert Redford was involved with. And they made 3 of Dad's books in that American mystery series. It was Skinwalker, Coyote Waits, and Thief of Time. And watched them. They worked with the Boston public television station, and they started filming them in Arizona. And then my father, who lived most of his life in New Mexico, said, no, 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 you need to move to New Mexico. So then they filmed them in New Mexico. And Dad, they were okay. And they were okay, but Robert Redford was really not so happy with them. So many years go by, and a gentleman named George R.R. Martin, who is the writer of the Game of Thrones books, he had been a friend of my dad. This is a long story, so I hope your readers are still awake. You should have another cup of coffee. I mean, your viewers. Anyway, my dad had been in a writing group in Albuquerque with George R.R. Martin. George was a young man, and the purpose of this writing group was to give young writers encouragement. And so my dad was there as sort of the senior advisor and mentor. And George R.R. Martin knew my dad, and got some good advice from Tony. So when years went by, George went to Robert Redford, or maybe vice versa. Anyway, the two of them agreed that it was time to try to do something new with Dad's stories. And because Dad had signed that contract many years ago, and I should say at this point, my father had died, but because Dad had signed that contract many years ago, they needed me as the trustee of my father's estate to re-sign it, to give the new George R.R. Martin, Robert Redford collaboration the go-ahead to try to make some new movies. And because I was using those same characters in my books, they also needed me to give them permission to use my books, because my books had the same characters. So I said yes, both as the trustee and as an author using those characters. So that was how things got started for the Dark Wind series. And then time went by, they had an option. They renewed the option. Another year went by. They renewed the option again. Another 6 months went by. They renewed the option again. And then finally, they actually were ready to make a television series. And so I'm a little embarrassed to tell you this part of the story, but they sent me the first script for the first episode of the first season, and I read it. And I thought it was awful. I thought, oh, what have I done? This is going to be totally embarrassing. But it wasn't. It was really good. And what it taught me was that there's a huge difference between being a writer who writes novels and a writer who writes screenplays. And when I saw how they had brought it to life, and it was what I had read, but I hadn't been able to picture it. And so I thought, okay, Dad's stories are in good hands. So that's kind of the origin of the Dark Wind series. Did that answer your question?
Perfectly.
Fantastic. Do you recall if Robert Redford ever mentioned what it was that drew him to your father's books? I imagine he was a fan, that he had read them, and just that spark must have gone off that made him think they would be great for a screen adaptation.
I think you must be right. I met Robert Redford, but I never actually had a conversation with him. So I can't answer your question from firsthand experience. But I know that Redford had deep affection for Native Americans and their way of life and their culture and their stories. And he also believed that they were often misrepresented in American media, and both in writing, but I think even more so in television and in movies. And so after he made the first 3 movies, I think one reason he was not satisfied with them was that there were not enough indigenous script writers working to develop the story, not enough Indigenous people on the crews doing the filming. So when he talked to me about, or when I got the invitation to read for him to redo Dark Winds, I knew that that was part of what his goal was.
And
And I have to say, my father very much respected him too, or he would not have signed the contract with him.
and how close are the scripts to the books? How much of a difference is there between the episodes and the books on which they are originally based?
Oh, that is a wonderful, wonderful question. There are huge differences. And I have to say, after the first season came out, I got so many emails from people who'd seen Dark Winds, and they were irate because they didn't exactly follow the books. And they would say, and I'm going to go ahead. I think for people who haven't seen this, I won't be spoiling anything. But in the first episode, they have brought Joe Leaphorn's wife Emma back to life, who has died like midway through the series. They have taken stories which were originally only Jim Chee stories or only Joe Leaphorn stories and put the two detectives together. In Dad's books, Bernadette Manuelito was never a full-fledged detective. She was always just the sweet young thing. She's so in love with Jim Chee. She was not a really a very good police officer. And they have brought her up, I think, using the images in my books to be not only a full-fledged police officer, but they introduce her as Jim Chee's boss. There are many, many changes. I could go on and on about that. But I think what I have to remember as an author, and what people who loved Dad's stories need to remember, is that television is different than books. And they used Dad's stories and my stories as inspiration. And then these script writers went on their own journey to develop something that would be attractive to a person watching a television series. And in a book, you have 200 pages or more to tell the story, to draw out the tension. In television, you have less than an hour. And you've got to, cram everything in. And also, people don't want to just hear words. They want to see the images. They want to see action. So those script writers had a whole different challenge than those of us who write novels have. But yes, there are many, many, many differences. And the movie that's coming, the television series coming out next is based on Dad's book, Dark Winds. Not Dark Winds, excuse me, The Ghost Way. I just happen to have one here, The Ghost Way. And that book, again, is only a Jim Chee book, but the writers bring in Joe Leaphorn and Bernadette Manuelito and Joe Leaphorn's wife, Emma. I haven't seen it, but it's not opening till next month, but I'm really excited to see how they've done it.
We are too. It's coming up soon.
It's really interesting to me to see how they've integrated elements from your books. And as you mentioned, Manuelito's influence is really strong in the TV series, which brings a very feminist outlook to the story, which perhaps I don't want to say that it was lacking in your father's books, but you really brought a different perspective on the role of the police in that territory and what they are doing on a daily basis.
It's so interesting that you bring that up. My father always said to me that he didn't think he did a good job of writing women characters. And mostly in his books, women do not have leading roles unless they are the victims. And so when I took over the series, or I shouldn't say took over, kind of reimagined the series about 10 years ago, one of my goals was to change it up in a way that was more respectful of the Navajo way, in which women own the property, the matriarchs have a lot of power. And also there are many women in police work because there are many Navajo women who join the armed services. And often after you've been in the Army or the Marines or the Air Force and you come back, the first job you get is with law enforcement. So yeah, I when I decided I was going to write about those characters, I thought it was time for women to have a bigger role. And I'm happy that the Dark Winds television series has done the same thing.
Mm. I'm curious to know if you remember going back to the moment that you first met these characters in your father's writing, your impressions of them. And then a second part to the question might be, how does that correspond and sometimes inevitably differ from the casting that the series currently has?
That's a lovely question. I read Dad's first book was The Blessing Way, and that was only a Joe Leaphorn book. And in that book, Joe Leaphorn is really not even the main character. Joe Leaphorn is kind of a sidekick to this anthropologist Carson or something McKee. I can't exactly remember the name. A white guy who's going to be solving the crime. And I liked that book. I liked the Joe Leaphorn character. I liked the way Dad had integrated a lot of Navajo cultural belief into the story. But Bergen McGee, I wasn't so crazy about Bergen McGee. And it's another case where there's a woman in jeopardy and Bergen McGee is rescuing her. I wasn't so crazy about all of that. And then the second book in Dad's series, Dance Hall of the Dead. That book was magic. That book won the Edgar Award for Best First Novel. And I think that was the book where I really thought, wow, I am a lucky woman to have such a brilliant father. And he did a good job in that book, not only of telling the story through Joe Leaphorn's eyes, but also of setting it at the Zuni Pueblo, of bringing in kind of archaeological malfeasance, of bringing in that was back in the 70s when the hippie culture was still going strong, having these kind of hippie characters who were really very believable. So yes, in answer to your question, I fell in love with those books. I have to say, I never had a chance to read them until they came out. And my dad never, he and I never talked about them ahead of time. And I was always so happy when he would give me a copy of one of the first editions. And anyway, it gave my heart a lot of joy. In terms of the casting, no, the casting is kind of the original idea, I think, of the script writers. My image of Joe Leaphorn, I think Zahn McClernand has done a very fine job with that character. But my image of Joe Leaphorn is stouter, heavier, and in Dad's books, Joe Leaphorn is the more acculturated of the two characters. Joe Leaphorn is the one who got his degree at Arizona State. He went to Phoenix. And he's very skeptical, I'll say, of Navajo beliefs. Whereas Jim Chee is the more traditional guy. Jim Chee is the one who's studying to be a medicine man, a Tali. Jim Chee is the one who speaks fluent Navajo, who knows a lot of the cultural stuff and really treats it with a lot more respect, whereas Leaphorn has a lot more skepticism about it. In the Dark Wind series, they've kind of turned those characters on their head. It works for TV, so yeah, I'm not complaining. My Bernadette Manuelito is shorter, stouter, more of a muscular take charge woman, whereas Jessica Madden is just beautiful and could be a model. My Bernie could not be a model, and she wouldn't want to be a model. I mean, my Bernie likes to drink her Cokes and eat her pizza, and she's more of a how can I say this? More of a rugged individual who could survive in the wilderness for 10 days. Whereas I don't know if Jessica Madden's Bernalito is tough, but I don't think she's as tough as the Bernie in my books.
And in the series, as well as in the books, the landscape plays a central role. In the books, there are lots of descriptions of the landscape, and in the series, it is absolutely stunning, the images that we get from New Mexico. But it's not just a background. I have the feeling that it also interacts somehow with the characters, that it defines them as a people. I mean, would you agree with this?
I would totally agree. I would totally agree. They really consider in traditional Navajo belief, the landscape is sacred. You know, we in America talk about Mother Earth, but in Navajo tradition, it really is Mother Earth. Their origin stories have them coming up from the underwood through a reed, and they go through several different layers before they reach what they call the glittering world. And the places on the Navajo Nation were set there by the holy people, especially for them, and all of them have deep, deep, profound meaning. And they bring out some of that in the series, which I very much appreciate. And I think again, when you're writing, you have more space and more words and more, you can use the reader's imaginations a little more. In Dark Winds, I mean, they've done an excellent job of showing beautiful, beautiful landscape. And I think in I don't remember what episode it was, but there's a helicopter crash, and then they Bernadette Manuelito gets to dive down, and they see the parts of the wrecked helicopter in the water. And that scene also is in the book, not with Bernadette Manuelito, of course, but having the helicopter crash, and it's set at Lake Powell. Anyway, I appreciate what they've done. I think they've done the best they can with that in television. And again, we have more leeway in books. I know when I was talking to my dad about continuing, I wasn't thinking I would continue the series at that point, but I was very curious about how his creative process worked. And he said to me, well, you know, honey, I come up with ideas for characters and ideas for stories. And then I realized, gosh, I've got to fill more than 200 pages. So I need to write about something else. And I think that was where the idea of writing more about Navajo cultural beliefs and writing more about the scenery and what role it plays, not only in Navajo tradition, but also in contemporary Navajo life. How, you know, when you live 60 miles from a grocery store, you know, you're more isolated. And so you rely more on your neighbors, and maybe you pay attention more to cars that are passing on the road than those of us who live in cities would. So anyway, landscape is crucial, both as the cultural framework, but just also as part of contemporary life on the Navajo Nation and in the Southwest in general, where all of us are a little more isolated than, say, people who live in Paris.
I was struck reading your books after having read your father's books at how similar and how different they are at the same time. And one element that I find absolutely striking in your books are beginnings. You are excellent at beginnings, in my opinion. There is no observation round in your books, at least in the ones I've read. I haven't read them all yet, I admit, but we are plunged right away inside the story. It's already begun without us, and we have to run after the story. Can you tell us a little bit about how you proceed when you try to put together a story and how it comes together in your mind and on the page?
Well, beginnings have always been really, really important to me. And when after my father died, really until that point, I was not thinking I would continue the series. But as Marissa mentioned, I wrote that book, Tony Hillerman's Landscape. And to do that book, my late husband and I, that's right, we traveled all over the Navajo Nation, going to places that my father had written about. And our goal was, my husband was a professional photographer, so he was taking the photos, and I was learning a little bit about those places. So that book came out, and as part of the job, my late husband and I we did a lot of talks at places where they like free talks, like libraries and Rotary clubs, other community service organizations. And every time I did that talk, I got the question, so are there going to be any more Jim Chee, Joe Leaphorn stories? Did your father have another book that was waiting to be published? Another book that perhaps a publisher could, dust off and finish, or an editor? Is there something else coming? And I would have to say, no, Dad really took care of business before he died. Then I could just read the disappointment in the person's face. And it dawned on me that I was sharing the same disappointment, that of course I was still grieving my father, but also I was anticipating not ever having another Joe Leaphorn Jim Chee story. And after a few months, it dawned on me that there was nothing I could do to bring my father back. But perhaps since I was a writer, perhaps I could try writing a mystery that had something to do with Jim Chee and Joe Leaphorn. So then I thought, well, darn, I've never written a mystery before. And all of these people asking these questions, and many, many more like them, are big fans of these characters. And several people would say to me when I was doing these talks, oh, well, I'm just going to go back and have to read the whole series again. They thought, yikes. So not only do they love these stories, they will have reread the whole series again, and they'll really know these characters. So I knew if I was going to get people's attention, I had to start with something where they would want to keep turning the page, something dramatic. And I thought, what would be the most dramatic thing I could do? And so I thought for people who haven't read it, I don't want to give it away, but I thought of something. I thought the most beloved of all Dad's characters was Joe Leaphorn, because he was the one that Dad began the series with. So if something were to happen to Joe Leaphorn, that would give one of my characters, Bernadette Manuelito. Dad had never done much with her. So I thought I can use her as a tool to make the series same, but a little different. And I have to establish her as not just a sweet young thing, not just Jim Chee's wife, but a competent law enforcement person. And I thought perhaps the way to do this will also involve Joe Leaphorn. So I worked on that opening chapter, as you noticed, for a long time. I knew I only get one chance to make a first impression. So I have to do a good job with this. So anyway, that was important to me. And then afterwards, I just thought, as a reader, I like to read something where right away I'm engaged. Like you said, I feel like I'm kind of, as a reader, I'm sort of running after the story to see where does it go and what happens next. I love reading books like that. So I thought I'm going to do my very best to write books like that. So often I will write, in specific answer to your question, I will write a placeholder chapter. I'll think this is what I want to do. I know it's not quite right, but I'll just try to move on and write the rest of the book. And then by the time I'm done, maybe done with that first draft, I'll have the idea of how to go back and make that first chapter better, because then I'll know what it needs to lead up to. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard work for me to do that, but I think it pays off, and it always brings me joy. So I hope it will for the readers too.
I'm sure it will, and it certainly has. Like Frank, I echo this appreciation for diving right into the story immediately, being immersed in something that's fascinating, that's really caught your attention. But then on top of that, you sustain this incredible sense of rhythm. It's not easy, I think, to have such a strong start and then maintain that level of curiosity. So I'm curious how you feel about rhythm and writing, and maybe how you would compare that to a series, which has a very different relationship to time, of course, with us needing to want to come back to every episode. How do you feel when you're watching the series, perhaps compared to that idea of rhythm in writing a novel?
And if may I add a little something? Not only is there this element of rhythm, but there's simultaneously a cozy element, which I really like in this universe. I mean, it feels good to meet these characters over and over again, and they feel like family. So, how do you combine these two, the tension as at the same time as the cozy element?
And apologies for a very multifaceted question.
Well, I'll do my best to answer it. The rhythm part, one thing that helps me with that, usually I will have the main story, which is either Bernadette Manuelito is the lead character, or perhaps it's a Joe Leaphorn again, or Jim Chee, or maybe two of the three. But I don't want usually I can't figure out how to have all three of them involved in the same story. So then I need a subplot, another story where the one who's not intimately involved in the main story has something to do. So part of the rhythm, I think, is balancing the tension between those two stories. I try to leave one story just where readers think, oh, what's going to happen? Will they be safe? Will they get run off the road? Will he drink the poison drink? Whatever is going on there. And then switch to the second story, which is is a Bernie safe? Will the cat get run over? I mean, whatever is going on there. So I think balancing between the two of those helps. I think the Dark Winds people have a much harder job because unless someone is streaming the whole series and watching episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, you have to wait a week if you're watching them live, and that's a long time to keep tension up while people are going on with their work and fixing dinner and going to the gym and doing all the other things and watching other things on television and keeping up with the news. So I think those people really have a big challenge. But the good thing about television, which in a way we writers have, but not exactly, often they'll start, say if it's episode 2, they give you a rehash of what happened in episode 1, just in case you forgot. But I think readers often are not inclined to go back and say, oh, what happened in chapter 10? Now I'm on chapter 11, but I don't really remember. I don't think readers do that. I think readers just try to keep moving forward. At least that's how I do it. So, um, the other way I think that I can keep rhythm going, I am lucky enough to have what I call beta readers, people who love to read mysteries, and people who are also, say, familiar with Navajo culture and a Navajo perspective, or people who know how police officers really work, or people maybe who understand more about medical stuff or the FBI or familiar with the landscape I'm writing about. And I'll ask them to take a look at the book after I have a solid draft done and tell me where they've lost interest. Tell me where they think, oh yeah, now I better go see if my laundry's done, or all the things that we do when we're a little bit bored. And I appreciate their honesty. And when they say, this is where you lost my attention, then I'll go back to those points and try to take out some description, take out some narration, maybe that isn't moving the story forward, to tighten it up so it does keep the suspense going. So that really helps me. In terms of the cozy element, that helps me too. I think none of us want to just constantly have our hearts beating 100 miles an hour. We like to have a chance to catch our breath. And so I can use those elements to give readers a little break from the tension, and also to help to build the emotional impact of the story, to let readers know a little bit more, maybe about some tension in the relationship between Jim Chee and Bernie Manuelito, what it's like when your husband is also your boss, and how that can lead to tension, lead to friction. So I'm able to use those elements, and I think that really is a kind of a big difference between the way I approach the series and the way my dad did. My dad was more, and my dad started in the 70s when our world was very different. And he was more of a kind of a straight police procedural, let's get the job done, and maybe we can have a shootout or have something catch on fire or blow up. Well, to have things blow up and catch on fire too, but also I like to have kind of people's hearts catch on fire with things. Say a working woman like Bernie who's dealing with her mother who's declining, and her sister who has a lot of issues and trying to do the best she can in her job. All of those modern tensions, and I think my dad didn't feel comfortable dealing with that. Whereas perhaps because that reflects my own story as a woman living in the modern world, I think that's part of life. And I think readers appreciate that kind of honesty, as well as a good story where the bad guys get what they deserve in the end.
And I just want to piggyback on something you mentioned about these kind of interpersonal family relationships that I think have carried over into the series, inspired by the writing that you've contributed to the characters. And I'm wondering, just in terms of how you feel about that evolving on screen, that evolution on screen, excuse me. How has that resonated with you? Do you sometimes find certain directions surprising? We mentioned the resurrection of the character of Leaphorn's wife, Emma, for instance. Can you tell us a little bit about, do you get to watch in advance, or do you discover it with the rest of us?
I don't get to watch in advance. I discover it with the average viewer. I was really surprised to learn that Joe and Emma had had a child. I think my dad would be too. And not only that, but that he'd been killed in an explosion. And that Joe Leaphorn has parents who are still alive. And that his dad was in law enforcement. All of that really surprised me. But it works fine in the series. It's kind of like, apples and oranges, or I don't know what you'd say, caramels and chocolate with marshmallow inside. It's just a different thing. In terms of my own evolution, one book one of my books is called Lost Birds. And that book has to do with a person who thinks she's Navajo, but who was adopted by a non-Navajo family, and her search for her roots. And I'm the eldest of 6 children, and my 5 siblings all were adopted by Tony and Marie Hillerman. And all of them came from different backgrounds. And one of my sisters has had 4 daughters, and one of her daughters was curious about what her mother's biological roots were. So she went through this whole adoption thing. And my adopted sister was very hesitant about learning who her biological family was. But as it turned out, and I should preface this, a lot of these stories don't have happy endings, unfortunately. A lot of them were young women who did not have happy lives and who hooked up with a man who was not meant to be a father either. But luckily, my sister, um, her biological family had also been looking for her. And it turned out that she had a lot of siblings who had been missing her really since she'd been put up for adoption and had tried to find her. And when my parents did these adoptions, it was when there was what was called closed adoption in the United States. So these children could not find out who their parents were. So anyway, having Joe Leaphorn deal with a case like this and having it have a happy ending really made me feel good about the whole adoption thing that my siblings had gone through. And I'm hoping if they or their children ever decide to do this research, that they will have the same kind of happy ending that the woman who Joe Leaphorn helped did have. I have to say, I think my 5 siblings were all lucky to have my mom and dad as parents. My mom and dad loved them to the moon and back, and they ended up with a good life. But still, it's different being adopted. I think it does something to a person's heart to think that their original mother, for some reason, couldn't raise them.
Mm. And it's interesting that that aspect gives a very modern feel to the story, this kind of emphasis on interpersonal relationships and the challenges of modern everyday life, trying to take care of family, career, etc. And at the same time, the series very much has the look, in a way, of the 1970s. It's set in that period. How do you feel about that transition to screen today, trying to represent that period in time?
I think it was brilliant. I think it was absolutely brilliant to set it. I mean, the best of Dad's writing, I think, was were those earlier books. And setting it in the 70s, they don't have to deal with cell phones, they don't have to deal with all of the technology now that Dad's detectives really use their brains to solve the crime. And I think it was just such a stroke of genius that the when in creating Dark Wind, they set it back in the 70s, then they could keep these characters a lot closer to the way that Dad had created them initially.
Mm.
So yeah, I love the costumes and the old cars, all of that. They did a lot of the filming about, maybe 30 miles outside of Santa Fe
Mm.
in a building that had been an old casino.
Mm.
And Tsuki Pueblo owned it. They built a new casino. And so this giant building was just sitting empty. So the Darkwoods people have used it. They reconstructed or constructed hospital where Emma works. They constructed the jail where Joe Leaphorn works. It's really, and outside they have all of these old cars from the 70s and trucks. They're all parked out there. It's kind of like a little museum. Anyway, they did a really good job with all of that. So they were smart. And the one that's coming up in February, The Ghost Way, they filmed a lot of it in Albuquerque. And Albuquerque has some old buildings that still are reminiscent of the 70s. And they were able to use the Sandia Mountains and view of Mount Taylor, all of that, but somehow also to make it, I guess, to make it look like Los Angeles. We'll see when it comes out, but excited about it. I they were smart. I think that was a really good question. I think they were smart to keep it in that setting.
I'd like to come back to what we talked about a few minutes ago about the landscape. It seems to me that there's a lot in the book and in the series that has to do with borders and boundaries. Um, um, on a geographical perspective, but also the borders between the Navajo Nation and the rest of the American nation, the border between the Navajo police force and the FBI, and how all of this interacts. Can you tell us a little bit about this in-between zone that we find this importance of the borders in this universe?
Oh, I'll try my best. I know it was in my father's books, particularly, there's a huge border between the Navajo police work and the FBI.
Mm.
And I think this was very much true when Dad was writing those books. There was the reality that these FBI guys were highly educated. A lot of them had been lawyers before they became law enforcement people. They were very much by the book and very much strangers to the Navajo way, and a lot of them to the whole world of the Southwest. And then on the other hand, you had Navajo law enforcement, mostly were people who were serving people who they had grown up with, or at least people who they knew, often people who were in their same clans, people, many of them people who did not speak any English. And so the way it works is if there is a murder, automatically the FBI is responsible. But so the FBI would come in and they were just like total strangers. They didn't know the people. They knew how the law worked, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. They didn't understand what the roots of the crime would be. And often they had a certain arrogance when they were approaching Native law enforcement. And by the same token, Native law enforcement looked at these guys as outsiders who just wanted to force their way around. So when I took over the series, I tried to tone this down a little bit because things have changed on both sides of the issue. I think there is still that border there, but there's a lot more, what can I say, neutral space between the FBI's border and the Navajo border. And in that space, I think Navajo people who have been off the reservation, who've gone to universities, who speak English and French and other languages, who are more sophisticated, say, than people were back when my dad started the series. And then on the other hand, you have how the FBI has realized that some of these Native people really should be FBI agents, that they are smart and they can be of huge help in solving these crimes. I think that middle ground has been approached when it more graciously when it in the 50 years since my dad started the series. The other interesting thing about borders, and I might have to write about this, is that now in the United States, there's a lot of um, animosity, particularly from the federal government against immigrants. And a lot of times, Navajo people, because they are dark skinned, because a lot of them are not, they don't drive fancy cars, they aren't well dressed, they have different values. And so they might be suspect as immigrants, maybe even what the federal government considers illegal immigrants, when in fact they are deeply, deeply rooted in America. There are indigenous people. So that border it's very interesting to me. I mean, they can't do anything with it in the Dark Wind series because of their setting in the 70s. But I think it would be fascinating to write about that now from the Navajo perspective. I mean, a lot of indigenous people have been arrested by the immigration people, and they are highly offended, of course, as they should be. And the immigration people say, well, we didn't know, but yeah, anyway. In terms of the borders, say borders between the Navajo Nation and the states, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, it's like all of that. Again, there are law enforcement issues. Say, there's a crime, a Navajo person commits a crime in Colorado off the Navajo Nation, but still it's a Navajo crime, and the Navajo police would be more apt to be able to take care of that. But their forces spread really thin. So then it might be a sheriff in one of the Colorado counties who handles it. And it was a mess when Dad was writing it, and it's still a mess. And I think it's something, if I were writing the script for Dark Winds, that is certainly something that I would use. I think the Dark people have done a good job bringing in the sheriff. I think his name is Senna, who works with Joe Leaphorn, and building up that friendship. I really admire them for that. Because again, that's based on professional respect and based on maybe different cultures, but still understanding the landscape, as you were saying, understanding what it takes to survive where there's not many jobs, where the climate is severe, where the old ways are valued, whether they're Hispanic or Indian. So I think that it was really a brilliant step of them from them to bring in Senna and have him as a partner with Joe Leaphorn.
Mhm. And I know that you're an executive producer for the series, and I know that there are several other executive producers, and so that title might mean different things for different people. Could you tell us a little bit about your role? Of course, I know that you're the trustee of your father's estate, so of course there's an important authorization there. Is there any other additional collaboration, or have people consulted with you? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
There's really not much to say. No, the only thing, even though I'm executive producer, my only role really was signing the contract to give them the rights to use my. I think they have the first 5 of my books and Dad's books. They're pretty much on their own. They invited me to go to the premiere of the very first season, which was lovely, and I got to meet the cast. And I've gone to a few of the filmings and been able to watch, and it's really fun. I got to meet Zahn McLernan and Kyra Gordon and Jessica Matten and some of the other cast people and of Chris Ayres, that one of the directors. It was the last scene of episode 3, when Bernadette Manuelito comes back from her experience with Border Patrol. And I think it's maybe a minute, if even, in the Dark Wind series. It took them all day to do that. The wind, there's horses involved, the wind was blowing, the horses were acting up, it started to rain, and it gave me great appreciation for how much patience they have and how much easier it is to write that scene when I'm just sitting at my computer and I don't have to deal with all those other elements.
Indeed.
But no, I would love to say as executive producer, I've had more to do with it, but I really haven't. But on the other hand, I think it's in good hands. So I'm happy that it's turned out as well as it has.
Excellent.
Speaking of the elements, can you tell us a little about the title, Dark Winds? Does it mean something special? I mean, what is that supposed to represent?
Well, the Dad did a book called Dark Wind, and Dark Wind that story was set on the Hopi Nation, and it was only a Jim Chee story, but the title referred to kind of an evil spirit that might take over someone's heart, like a more than a bad mood, sort of like a real malaise, deep evil malaise. And so that's a version of that is what the title is. The title of the TV series. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. And could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now? What's next for Anne Hillerman?
I would be glad to. I just turned in the 12th book in the Bernadette Manuelito, Jim Chee, Joe Leaphorn series. That story is going to be set at Canyon de Chelly, which is a very special sacred place on the Navajo Nation. And it involves Mustang horses and Mustang genetics. And it puts Bernie and her sister, Darlene Manuelito, at the center of the story, but also brings in Joe Leaphorn in a bigger role than he's had in some of my books. So that book will be out in 2027. And the reason that it's going to be late is that I'm also going to be starting a new series, not with Navajos, but that involves a detective who specializes in crimes and malfeasance and suspicious behavior in the world of museums.
Oh, wonderful.
Fantastic.
And I'm going to set the first story in Santa Fe. And then after that, we'll see if she becomes a national or an international detective or if she just stays in the Southwest.
I'm really looking forward to that. Oh.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Me too.
We usually like to end the podcast by asking our guests if there's a question we haven't asked, which you wish we had asked.
I think you've done a fine job of covering everything. I just wanted to show you, though, for your readers who don't know, I was really pleased that a couple of my books have been published in French. It was Rivage who did them, and I had an invitation to go to a noir conference, which was not in Paris, somewhere, but I was going to fly into Paris, and that was right when the pandemic shut everything down. I was so disappointed. But anyway, I had even started to learn a little bit of French, so I could at least, navigate my way through the train stations. So anyway, I'm hoping that I'll have another invitation.
Oh, we hope so too, so that we can come see you and have you sign at least a book. We won't bring the whole file.
Thank you. I would be glad to.
Thank you so much, Anne Hillerman. It was wonderful speaking with you tonight, our time, and noon, 1 o'clock your time. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Thank you for the opportunity. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to After Images. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and follow After Images podcast on social media.
After Images.